What's up, everyone? Today, I'm excited to introduce you to a straightforward, flexible, and highly aggressive opening system for white. It all begins with the English opening, starting with the move pawn to c4. Your opponent will play pawn to e5. Why? Because by playing pawn to c4, you've taken control of the d5 square, making it less appealing for them to push their pawn there. As a result, pawn to e5 becomes their logical response. After that, both sides focus on development. So far, so good. You play knight to f3, attacking their central pawn. Black usually defends it because advancing the pawn with pawn to e4 is a poor choice. Why? After knight to g5, their pawn on e4 becomes overextended and isolated from the rest of black's forces, making it easy for you to capture. Instead, black typically defends the pawn with knight to c6. And here comes the critical moment, you play pawn to e4. This transforms the game into a structure somewhat similar to the four knights game, but with a twist. If your pawn were still on c2, it would be the classic four knights setup. However, with the pawn on c4, the position gains an added layer of complexity and opens up unique opportunities for white. In this position, most of your opponents will develop their bishop to c5, entering a structure reminiscent of the Italian game. The bishop on c5 aims to occupy the active diagonal, and may even support a potential knight to g4 attack on your position. However, you've got a clever surprise prepared. Knight takes c5. This is a temporary knight sacrifice since black can capture it, but after they do, you immediately respond with pawn to d4, launching a double attack that wins back your piece on the very next move. Not only do you regain material, but you also start building pressure on black. What makes this position so effective is that it's incredibly challenging for black to find the correct defensive moves. In most cases, they make a mistake, leading to a devastating loss. In similar situations, black's best move is typically to save their bishop. As it's considered slightly stronger than a knight, they might try bishop to d6, hoping you'll trade pieces. If you take their bishop, they can recapture with their own bishop, leaving them with a solid position. But here's the first major surprise. In this specific position, bishop to d6 is a losing blunder. Why? Because you don't trade pieces. Instead, you play pawn to c5, creating a double attack on both the bishop and the knight, completely ruining black's position. If you capture the bishop on d6, not only do you win material, but you also block black's development. Their pieces become cramped and struggle to find active squares. On top of that, you threaten to win back not just one piece, but potentially two, turning the tables in your favor with significant interest. At this point, black often tries to mitigate the damage by capturing on c5, hoping to gain a pawn in exchange for their bishop. But you surprise them again. Instead of recapturing the bishop, you strike with pawn to d5, attacking their knight. The knight now has no good squares. It can't move to e5 because your queen controls that square, and it's forced to retreat all the way back to g8, a humiliating setback. At this point, you already have a commanding position with better development and active pieces. From here, you can launch an aggressive attack by playing queen to g4, creating another unpleasant surprise. This move targets the pawn on g7, putting black on the defensive. They have limited options to protect it, and you remain in full control of the game. If black moves their king, it becomes centralized and highly vulnerable to your future attacks. Alternatively, if they retreat their bishop back to f8, it's a tragic sight for black, as it looks like they're simply resetting their pieces for the next game. Most often, black will play pawn to g6 instead. However, this weakens their dark squares significantly, and these weaknesses will become a key target for you later. At this point, you can play a prophylactic move by repositioning your queen. Currently, your queen is directly opposite their bishop, and if black ever pushes their pawn forward, this could create problems for you. To prevent this, it's wise to move your queen back one square to a safer position, preparing for your upcoming attack. After that, black typically tries to activate their pieces with a move like pawn to d6. Here, you strike with bishop to g5, taking full advantage of the weaknesses in their position. Now, what can black do? If they play queen to d7, it's an awkward move that hampers their development. You can simply castle queenside, activating your rook along the open d-file, putting immense pressure on black. If instead, black tries a more natural move like knight to a7, you can immediately exploit their position. Play knight to d5, putting pressure on the knight and threatening to capture it. The only way for black to defend the knight is by playing pawn takes d5. But this leads to an elegant finish. You respond with knight to f6, delivering a check to their king. After the king moves, you follow up with bishop to h6, dominating the weakened dark squares and delivering a checkmate. Returning to the main line, after you sacrifice your knight on e5, some opponents might try to be clever. Instead of immediately recapturing the knight, they might capture the pawn on c5 first, thinking they can regain the knight later while exposing your king. However, their trickiness backfires. This solution ends up worse than the problem because after you play pawn to d4, you completely dominate the game. You establish a powerful pawn center, creating a massive pawn avalanche in the middle of the board. If black's knight retreats, you push pawn to e5, forcing the other knight to retreat as well. With your pawns controlling key squares, black's pieces are pushed into passive positions. Meanwhile, you maintain a strong pawn center and 2 active bishops, giving you a significant advantage. Let's rewind a couple of moves. After you play pawn to d4, black might instead try knight to g4, launching an attack on your position. But this attack fizzles out immediately. You simply move your king back to g1, ensuring it is completely safe. Now, black's knight on g4 is in serious trouble. You're threatening pawn to e5, and once the first knight moves, the second knight on g4 will be lost. Black must act quickly. If they try something like pawn to d6 to stop your advance, you can respond with pawn to h3, forcing their knight back to the awkward square h6. From here, black's knight is completely misplaced, with no active squares to jump to. They might even consider retreating it all the way back to g8, an ironic and pointless maneuver that shows just how dire their position has become. At this stage, it's your turn to press the advantage. Play bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6 to their queen. This is a powerful move because black lacks a dark squared bishop to counteract the pin. From here, you can push pawn to e5, exploiting the pin and solidifying your dominance. At this point, black's position is on the verge of collapse. For instance, if you play pawn to e5, knight to e5, or queen to f3, something decisive is coming, and you can easily capitalize on the pin. If black castles, you can play knight to d5, and the poorly placed knight on h6 becomes a liability. Because of the pin, the knight on f6 is under pressure, leaving the knight on h6 with no safe squares to escape. Once you trade on f6, black must recapture with their pawn, exposing their king and leaving the knight on h6 completely trapped. Not only do you gain material, but you also leave black with a vulnerable king and a crumbling position. Another common response from black is to capture the pawn on d4, which seems like the simplest solution. However, this move is also a mistake. After queen takes d4, you gain a completely dominating position. You now have a strong pawn center and a pawn structure that holds black's position in check. Black's pieces are restricted, they can't advance or become active. Meanwhile, your queen is centralized and active, and your 2 bishops dominate the board with control over key diagonals. This gives you a significant positional advantage. For example, if black tries to regroup by retreating their knight, you continue to develop naturally. If they castle, you can follow up with simple yet effective moves. After you castle, your plan is straightforward: develop your bishop, reinforce the pawn with pawn to f3 if needed, and place a rook on d1. From here, you can play knight to e5, further increasing your control of the board. Your position is easy to play, while black struggles to find active plans, leaving them in a passive and difficult situation. In this game, black attempted knight to b4. Seemingly looking for counterplay, white responded with an excellent move, queen to g3, stepping away from the potential fork on c2 while also aligning the queen with black's king. White was even willing to sacrifice the pawn on e4, prioritizing a kingside attack. After black captured the pawn on e4, hitting white's bishop, white remained unfazed and activated another piece, placing the bishop on a strong square. Black decided to capture the second bishop, but this was the turning point. White responded with bishop to h6, exploiting the absence of black's dark squared bishop. This is a critical theme. Without a dark squared bishop, black's dark squares become weak, and white's bishop takes full advantage. The pin created by the bishop on h6 sets up a devastating attack. Queen takes g7 is now an immediate checkmate threat. If black tries pawn to g6, the dark square weaknesses persist, and white can exploit them further. In the game, black chose queen to f6, but this revealed another vulnerability: the weak back rank. White played rook to e1, threatening rook to e8, which would deliver checkmate. Surprisingly, black had no good defense. If they tried king to f8, white unleashed a brilliant combination. Bishop takes g7, a temporary sacrifice to distract black's king. Once the king captured the bishop, white followed up with rook takes queen, leaving black's king completely exposed. From here, white could play rook to e1 or queen to g8, delivering checkmate within a move or two. This sequence leaves white in a completely winning position. Thanks for watching video till end.